In this video, we will be discussing the new cluster-specific permissions for Cloudera Manager 6. Before we start, let's review the requirements for this feature. You need a Cloudera Enterprise license, Cloudera Manager 6.0.0 or higher, and a compatible CDH version, such as CDH 5.14.3. There's no specific requirements for the authentication type. You can use this feature with local users, Active Directory, SAML, or an external program. This feature allows you to assign a scope to several Cloudera Manager user roles. And what the scope does is it limits which clusters a user can access for a specific user role. It gives you more fine-grained control over what a user can see or do. With more control over what users can see or do, you can limit the chance of someone doing something outside the scope of their responsibilities. Here I have a new cluster with the default full administrator user, and we're going to log in as him. And this is a Cloudera Manager 6 deployment with CDH 5.14.2. This deployment has two clusters, Cluster 1 and Cluster 2. Now, if we go to the user profile for the admin user, we can see that it is a full administrator account. And that's important. We need an account that can create new users and assign them roles. On the Users and Roles tab, we're going to add several users. We're going to add a user named Milton, a user named Lucy, and a user named Edith. If I expand the roles field, you can see all the default user roles that Cloudera Manager ships with. These roles apply to every cluster in the deployment. And here we'll finish creating the other users named Edith and Lucy. Staying on the Users and Roles page, we're going to navigate over to the Roles tab and create cluster-specific roles and assign them to Milton, Edith, and Lucy. Click on the Add Role button and a window appears. We're going to create a new role that gives the cluster administrator privilege on Cluster 2. Then we're going to assign this role to both Edith and Milton. Next, we'll create a cluster administrator on Cluster 1 and assign that role to Milton. Next, we're going to create a read-only user role that has privileges on both Cluster 1 and Cluster 2, and assign it to Lucy. When you give a role access to all the clusters in a deployment, it functions the same as the default user roles that Cloudera Manager ships with. Now let's log in with each user to make sure that our user roles are correct. If we log in with Edith, we can see that she has the cluster administrator role on Cluster 2 only. We can confirm this further by seeing what actions Edith can take on Cluster 2. We see that she can perform all the cluster administrator actions that we expect. Now let's repeat this process with Milton. We expect to see the cluster administrator role on Cluster 1 and cluster administrator role on Cluster 2. We'll go ahead and confirm this by checking what actions Milton can perform on Cluster 1 and Cluster 2. And we can see that he can perform the cluster administrator actions on both clusters. Now it's Lucy's turn. We had assigned Lucy the read-only role for both Cluster 1 and Cluster 2, so she should only be able to perform the read-only actions on those clusters. If we do the same checks we did for Milton and Edith, we can see that's the case. Lucy can only perform the read-only actions on Cluster 1 and Cluster 2. Now, if we log back in with the admin account, we're going to go ahead and change Lucy's roles. On the Roles tab again, we're going to create a read-only role that only applies to Cluster 2 and assign that to Lucy. Then, from the list of roles, we're going to click on the Assign button for the read-only role for Cluster 1 and Cluster 2 and unassign that role from Lucy. Then, we'll look for the cluster administrator on Cluster 1 role and assign that to Lucy too. So now Lucy has read-only on Cluster 2 and Cluster Administrator on Cluster 1. We can confirm that on the Users page. If we log out with the admin account and log back in with Lucy, we can confirm that these roles are accurate with her account. We see that on Cluster 1, Lucy can perform the Cluster Administrator role actions, and on Cluster 2, Lucy can only perform the read-only user role actions. This video showed you how to use cluster-specific permissions with local users. If you're using another authentication system, for example ODAP, you can assign the ODAP group to a cluster-specific role. Thank you for watching.